We're delighted to welcome Thomas Piketty tonight to the Columbia Maison Francaise for a talk on inequality in America, the 1% in international and historical perspective. And this talk was organized by the Maison Francaise, working in collaboration with the Program for Economic Research as a co-sponsor, and we are also joined by the Heyman Center as a co-sponsor. Sometimes it takes an outside observer to identify certain social realities that have escaped notice to insiders. Alexis de Tocqueville was one such outside observer of American society. His Democracy in America, published in 1835, remains a classic today. And central to his book was an analysis of the social conditions that led to the disappearance of the aristocracy and the growth of a more egalitarian, democratic society in America. Thomas Piketty and Emmanuel Saez have also managed, as outside and as French observers, to shed new light on a key social fact of American life today. Not democracy in America, but inequality in America. Piketty and Saez compiled and analyzed statistical data going back to the early 20th century. And one of their key innovations was to examine not just inequality in earnings concerning the top decile, but concerning the top 1%, and even the top 1% of the top 1%. And their comparative research, along with other co-authors, allowed them to put these changes over time for top earners into an international perspective. Their work has found its way into White House budget documents, the media, and even presidential politics. The New York Times describes them as, quote, two academically revered, if publicly obscure, left-leaning French economists whose work is the subtext for the battle over tax fairness. And the Wall Street Journal has called them rock stars of the intellectual left, which I don't think was meant as a compliment in the case of the Wall Street Journal. The 1% and the 99% have become part of our lexicon and provided a slogan for the Occupy Wall Street movement. And today, these numbers, these percentages fuel public debates about inequality and fairness in America. So we're delighted to have Thomas Piketty, who will now be presented by Bernard Salenier, who's a professor of economics here at Columbia.
So welcome everyone. I see Thomas is paling because of my title. So we share a number of themes, an interest in public finance and policy and a Parisian accent, but there will be no embarrassing picture here. So the first embarrassing thing I will not mention in terms of dates is when you were born. All I will say is that in 1989 you entered École Normale Supérieure, which everyone in France except those who graduated from École Polytechnique agrees is the most elite school in the world. And the remarkable thing is that this is something you enter when you have something like an associate degree, or at least 2 years of college. And the second date is in 93, you got your PhD. So for all PhD students in the room, this is, I still won't say when Thomas was born, but I will just say that this is somewhere like 30% younger than the average date of completion of PhD. So this is an example for you, 4 years. In 1996, Thomas, still very young, became the co-editor of the Journal of Public Economics, the main journal in public finance, which he still is, right? Not fired yet. And in 1998, he started another job, which has made him maybe not a rock star, but he's very well known in France. He became a columnist, or an invited columnist at Libération. So Libération is part of the French intellectual history. In the 60s, it was very much to the extreme left. It's a bit more center-left these days. But this is definitely not, so Shani has mentioned that Thomas has been characterized as a left-leaning economist, which is probably true. But I will have more to say about this. And one thing that has also been a very important contribution of Thomas is in 2005 when the Paris School of Economics was born. So the academic landscape in France was fairly sleepy, very bureaucratic. It still is in a number of ways, but things have improved a great deal. And this is partly due to the effort of Thomas and people like him. And I would like to cite also Jean-Jacques Lafont in Toulouse, who left us, unfortunately, as well as Richard Descoings at Sciences Po. So they are among the people who have contributed to greatly improve academic economics in France, and academics in general, I should say. So now that I've given the 5 dates, I should just sum up the various contributions that Thomas made to economics. So he started as a theorist, and actually when I looked up his citations, which is what we like to do as academics when we pretend to be preparing classes, 2 of his top 5 most cited papers are still theory contributions. Now Thomas moved more towards looking at data, very painstakingly. Occasionally I will show you one book that is a very good example, but he still keeps this interest in theory and the ability to connect the data and the theory, which is essential in our profession. So let me go to the pictures now. This is the first book that Thomas published, still not very old. It's called High Incomes in France in the 20th Century, Inequality and Redistribution, 1901 and 1998. And again, you can see something that would really appall the Wall Street Journal. This is a title by the communist daily L'Humanité, Mankind, that says, the rich must pay. This is not to say that this is what Thomas had in mind, although you can judge by his presentation later. Then he has published a number of important papers, including the one that was mentioned by Shani P. earlier with Emmanuel Saez, on the distributions and the change of distribution of top incomes, meaning well into the top centile of the income distribution. And this has contributed in particular to fuel this book, which he edited with Tony Atkinson, a very eminent economist in Britain, Top Incomes in Global Perspective, where he has contributed over the years studies on top incomes in France, top wealth and estates in France, top incomes in India, top incomes in America, of course, and I hope I'm not forgetting too many countries on the way. So another book that was meant to provide some food for thought in advance of the French presidential and general election last year, which he co-wrote with Emmanuel Saez and his former student Camille Landais, is called For a Fiscal Revolution. So it's revolution again. And it's the subtitle, which you probably cannot see, says An Income Tax for the 20th Century. And it was a very wide-ranging and consistent plan to reform taxation in France, which came actually with a website in which you could test your own tax plan. If you wanted to reform the French taxation system your own way, you would get results to what would happen to various centiles, deciles in the income distribution. Now, I have mentioned that Thomas is also a columnist, and he has published 2 books that collect his essays in Libération. So the first one, this is probably the right title for today, is Hooray for the American Left. So this is his contributions to Libération from 1998 and 2004. And the second one, which was published more recently, has a title that sounds a little bit more pessimistic, and this one has an exclamation mark, this one has a question mark. Can Europe be saved? Or can we save Europe? And maybe you can ask questions to Thomas later about what he thinks should be done or can be done to save Europe. So Thomas is a man of great intellectual talents, of extreme intellectual integrity. He knows everything there is to know about inequality in France, in America, in India, in the world in general, and we are very happy to have him.
For these kind words, and thanks a lot for inviting me. I'm very glad to talk here in New York about this topic. Before talking more about inequality in America, just let me tell you that most of my time I actually don't write columns for Libération. I have been trying to work on the history of inequality and income and wealth distribution for the past 15 years now. And the main motivation for doing so came from the observation 15 years ago as a young theorist, as Bernard reminded us, that we knew really very little about the history of inequality. And for a very long time, let me put this into a broader context. For a very long time, the question of long-run trends in the distribution of income and wealth was really the key question asked by economists, and somehow it disappeared during the 20th century, I think mostly for bad reason, and I think it's high time to put this question again at the center of economic analysis. So in the 19th century, it was pretty obvious to everybody that the question of distributional trends was a key question. And I guess because people, from all political persuasion saw around them very radical change in the structure of production with the Industrial Revolution, the rise of manufacturing capital, and they were trying to predict the future. They were trying to say, okay, the world has changed a lot as compared to 30 years ago. How will the social structure and the distribution of income and wealth, how will it look like 50 years from now? And somehow they all came with apocalyptic predictions, in the sense that, Ricardo and Marx, for instance, both believe that a small group in society, either landowners in the case of Ricardo or industrial capitalists in the case of Marx, will capture an ever-growing share of income and wealth. And the common point between many of these economists, it's also true for Malthus to a large extent, was that no balanced development path could occur. So a balanced development path is a path of growth where everything goes up at the same rate. Okay, so wages grow, profits grow, real estate prices, oil prices, asset prices, wealth, income, everything goes up smoothly. Now, at that time, it was very hard for economists to imagine that this could happen. And they all came with pretty apocalyptic conclusions. Now, many of these apocalyptic conclusions turned out to be wrong, but I will argue that, these people were asking the right questions and probably didn't come with the right answer. To say the truth, they had very little data and very little observation. And, Marx was observing the profits in the British manufacturing sector in the 1850s, a little bit of statistical evidence, and from this he was trying to predict the future of the universe, which of course was a difficult task. And so there was very little data, but at least I think they were asking the right question, and I think we abandoned this question partly for bad reasons. So during the 20th century, a more optimistic consensus emerged, with really the view that growth is a rising tide that lifts all boats, which is a way to describe a balanced development path that is, after a certain stage of development, inequality reduces, or at least you have everybody benefits from growth in the same proportion. And so one name associated with this is really Kuznets, who was an American, Russian-born, but American economist, who computed the first national accounts, so the first computation of national income of the United States. And after he had done that, he thought, okay, now the next step is to compute the first series on inequality. So what he did is that he used the data that was there and that is still there, coming from the income tax. So the income tax had been created in 1913 in the United States. So he used data on top income coming from the income tax between 1913 and 1948, and he divided by his estimate of the national income of the United States, and from this he got a series on income distribution. Now this was only 35 years long, this was only one country, but this was a lot more than what everybody had before, as compared to Marx, Ricardo, and every other economist. This was the first time there was something like a statistical series on income distribution, and the great finding was that there was a reduction in inequality at that time. So this was a great news, especially in the Cold War context. Everybody was able to say to the world, well, especially to poor countries, don't turn socialist. All what you have to do is to wait, and when you get to the stage of American development, then inequality will be reduced together with growth, and you don't need a tough solution. So there were people really wanted to believe this message and wanted to believe that the message of the Kuznets curve, as it was referred to at that time, was a universal mechanism. So there were stories which Kuznets himself did not really believe, but the most common story was, okay, development is a matter of moving from a low-pay rural sector to a high-pay urban manufacturing sector. So at the beginning of development, inequality increases because only a minority benefits from the growing sector. But when everybody moves in to the high-pay sector, everybody is rich and inequality. So it's a very simplistic model, but if it was true, of course, it would be nice. To tell you the truth, Kuznets was more subtle than this and was very well aware that during the 1913-1948 period in the US and elsewhere, there was a lot more going on. And of course, the world wars and the institution and policy which came with the wars and the Great Depression certainly played a big role, and he was aware of that it was not just a spontaneous process. But somehow people wanted to believe in this spontaneous process, and this temporarily sort of put an end to the sort of the grandiose questions that people ask in the 19th century and this kind of apocalyptic conclusion. Now, the big rise in inequality that we have seen since the 70s, so particularly in the US, and I will come to this in a minute, but as you probably know, about 60% of US macroeconomic growth between 1976 and 2007 was absorbed by the top 1%, and if you take the top 10, you have about 70% of total growth. So, that doesn't look like a balanced development path, because if you have such a large fraction of the growth going to a small group, if this continues forever, you have a problem. At some point this has to stop. Where is that going to stop? Nobody knows. And, this clearly the conclusion I draw from this is that 19th century economists raise the right question. We need to address these questions again. We have no strong reason to believe in balanced development paths. And apart from this basic US evidence, more generally, if you replace the price of land, which Ricardo was very worried about in the long run, by the price of oil or the price of real estate in New York or Paris, it's clear that what we have over the past 20 to 30 years doesn't look like a balanced development path, and there are serious questions about what is the long-run distribution of income or wealth gonna look like. Okay, so let me, before I move to America, just say that I have no particular taste for apocalyptic prediction, and that I don't want to claim that divergence forces, so forces pushing toward more inequality, necessarily dominate. I think you have powerful convergence and divergence forces. The most powerful convergence forces, by which I mean forces pushing toward more equality, are really the diffusion of knowledge, the diffusion of skills, technology, both between countries, and this can be fostered by economic and financial integration, and within countries, which requires adequate educational institution, investment in skills, etc. So these forces, do exist and are very powerful. And the catching up of a number of emerging countries with rich countries is certainly evidence for the existence of these convergence forces. But at the same time, divergence forces can be stronger, at least for a very long period of time. So here I mentioned just two divergent forces. One simple but powerful mechanism is that when top earners set their own pay, they tend to go too far, and evidence, historical evidence, especially in this country, suggests that this can create large divergence in income shares going to the various groups. And another example of a divergence process is the fact that when the rate of return is larger than the growth rate, and this is particularly likely to happen in low-growth, mature economies. Then you have a very obvious mechanism that can make the distribution of wealth diverge, which is that, if the top Forbes fortune keep increasing in the next 40 years at the rate at which they have increased over the past 30 years, 5, 6, 7, 8% per year, if, world output or world income increases only at 2, 3, or 4%, you have a very powerful divergent mechanism, which is very troubling, but which, if you're looking for an evil law of capitalism, this should probably be something like this. The fact that the rate of return structurally in the long run can be, and actually is larger than the growth rate, that's a very powerful, potentially divergent mechanism. So now coming to specifically to inequality in America, the starting point for this lecture will be that inequality in the US now is larger than ever before in American history, or, just to give a number, you have about 50% of US national income going to the top 10%, including about 20 to the top 1, which is the highest level recorded in US history, and this is also approximately the same level as the record high levels that we had in what I will call old Europe for the sake of it, and taking UK and France as a typical example at the eve of World War I, where you had an extreme level of inequality that was very much comparable to this, in terms of numbers. Now, the general question is, the fact that you have the same level of inequality does not imply that you have exactly the same structure of inequality. So the question is, does US inequality keep a distinctive and meritocratic character, or is the new world simply becoming like old Europe? And the answer that I will give looks as follows. In the rest of the talk, I will try to show you that, as compared to UK or France 1910, current US inequality has definitely a different structure. It is more based upon labor income and less upon inherited wealth. But, and there are two important buts to this claim, the first important caution is that this is mostly a matter of degree, should not be exaggerated. So the concentration of wealth, in the US right now, you have about, wealth is always more concentrated than income. So right now in the US, you would have 75% of aggregate wealth going to the top 10% wealth holders. Now it is true that in France or UK, before World War I, it was 90%. So 75 is less than 90, but as you can see, we are not talking about it's a matter of degree. It's not a change in civilization. You still have, very, it will be very wrong to imagine that, because human capital has replaced financial capital and real estate capital, we don't care at all about wealth anymore and inheritance anymore. That would be a major mistake. Labor income plays a more important role than a century ago, but much less so than people often tend to imagine. Okay? And the second point is that this enormous rise in top labor income in the recent decade in the US, I think has little to do with merit, or in fact, has much less to do with merit than what the dominant discourse tends to pretend, which in a way, in a way it can be the worst of all worlds, because you have as much inequality as in the past, but in addition, you are explaining to the poor that this is their fault somehow, because they are just less smart than the richest. And of course, if that was absolutely true, if we were absolutely sure about it, maybe we should say it. But given that it's wrong, I think it's bad. That can be quite stressful. And at least I will argue that the same level of inequality during in France, Belle Époque or Ancien Régime, nobody was trying to depict this as particularly fair. When Vautrin was talking to Rastignac in Le Père Goriot about the inequality of wealth in France in the 1830s, he was not trying to pretend that this was fair. So this was tough for those who were at the bottom, but at least they were not depicted as stupid as compared to people at the top. Okay, so this is the roadmap. So a lot of the data I'm going to show you comes from this website. Okay, so what we've done in this, so you will find this easily online, the World Top Income Database. We have put together all the historical series on inequality we have computed. So all the countries in red are the countries for which we have data, and countries in blue. Actually, some countries in blue on this map have become red since then, but are countries in blue where work is being done to include the country in the database. Okay, so I was very fortunate after I did this book on France and the history of income distribution in France in 1998. First, as far as I remember, this was first published in the Journal of Political Economy with an editor that was Pierre-André Chiappori, as far as I remember, in 2001, I guess. Well, anyway, after having done that in France, I was very fortunate to find great co-authors to expand it to many countries. So Tony Atkinson did it for the UK, and he took me in this project of editing 2 books with 20 countries. I did it with Emmanuel Saez for the US, who also then did it for Canada, Japan. In the end, we have more than 20 people have been involved in this project, and of course, I would never have been able to do it on my own. This is, in a way, all we are doing is to extend what Kuznets had done in the 50s, except that Kuznets had 1 country for 35 years, and we have 25 countries for a century. But in terms of method and care with the data, that's, we are just following what he had done. There's nothing particularly clever in this. It's just, it requires very tedious work of getting the data and using it right. But, that's it. Okay, so let me show you some of the lessons. So this graph, maybe you have already seen it, shows the evolution of the share of US national income going to the top decile. And so you can see that at the end of the period, you have about 50% going to the top 10%, whereas it was between 30 and 35% until the 70s. So this is really a huge change. So Kuznets basically at this part, but he stopped in the 50s, and we put this part on the graph. So of course, this changes quite a bit the picture, and the fact that the previous high point was in 1928 at the eve of the Great Depression. Of course, has attracted quite a lot of attention. I would like here to emphasize the fact that we are really talking about a huge change in the distribution. And when you see these numbers, at some point, it's hard to remember all these numbers about inequality. But just when the share of national income goes from 35% to 50% in the space of 10 years, you really have to ask the question, is that going to happen again during the following 30 years? Where is that going to stop? Because the orders of magnitude are really enormous. If you go to 70% of national income going to the top 10, at some point you just have a problem, because sometimes economists tend to say, well, wherever the market is driving us is probably efficient, but at some point, just this is a huge transfer, which represents, another way to put it is that this represents the equivalent of 70% of US macroeconomic growth in this 30-year period, and that's really problematic. So you see all the variation at the end of the period. In fact, that's mostly due to capital gains, which are of course very cyclical. So I don't know why some of so this is the series without the capital gains, and then you can see that you have the same general trend, but of course without the sharp fluctuation. Okay, because the capital gains is the money that you make by selling capital assets, so typically by selling stock. Well, of course, when the stock market is very low in 2008 and 2009, you make very little capital gain, and it was the same in 2000, just after the previous crisis. But the important point is that the trend, there's a trend that keeps going on. So here we see that in 2010, the top incomes have started to increase again, and the preliminary data we have for 2011 suggests that this is happening again. So there's no reason to believe that the trend is going to be reversed in the near future. That's the bottom line, is that financial crises per se do not affect the trend. You know, they have a cyclical effect on the variation, but the long-run pattern is not affected by financial crisis. Okay, so the reason why there was a big change after the 30s in the Great Depression is that, of course, it was not just a financial crisis. You know, it was first, it was a huge crisis, much deeper than in the past 4 years, and then it was followed by World War II. You know, there was a huge change in policies, and in particular in tax policy. So that doesn't seem to be the road that we are taking right now. Now, if you look at the decomposition, so here we decompose the top 10% income into 3 groups. Top 1, next 4, next 5, so that everybody can recognize himself or his friends or everybody and see what we are talking about. So to get into the top 10, you need to make more than $100,000 as a tax unit in 2010, and to enter the top 1, you need to make more than 350. So you can see that most of the action is really taking place at the level of the top 1. But you know, the groups just below the top 1 also have a rise. Okay, so these are typically between 150 and 350. So these are my fellow US-based academic economists about, you know, and as you can see, they've been doing pretty well, and you know, since the 80s and 90s. And I think, you know, this has a strong impact on the way they view the world. I think, you know, it will be strange, you know, if economists were the only profession whose income had no impact on their view of the world. And you know, they tend to believe that the American economy is working efficiently and is rewarding talent and marginal product as it should. And but the truth of the matter is that, you know, as compared to the people above them, they have not been that successful. Okay. Now, there is no other country in the world where we find such a large rise of inequality in the past 30 years. So I'm not going to be able to show you every country, but let me go through very quickly a number of countries. You know, first, if we compare US, UK, Germany, France, you can see that, you know, at the beginning of the, so sorry, the graph is complicated because, you know, the history of inequality is always a political history, so you have lots of change due to, you know, not only change in the business cycle, in financial crisis, but also wars, change in government, and many other factors. But the bottom line is that the huge rise in the top decile share in the US that you observe at the end of the period, you know, you don't see it in France and Germany, you know, where you have sort of a rise in the top shares, but it's still between 30 and 35%. You know, it's, as compared to the 45-50% in the US, it's much smaller, and in the UK, it's in between. Okay? Now, it has not always, the important point is that the US has not always been the most inegalitarian country. You know, in fact, at the beginning of the century, the share of income going to the top decile was bigger in France or in the UK. Okay? So France and the UK were more inegalitarian than the US. And in fact, even until the 60s, so I'm sorry you cannot read the date here, okay. You probably you need to do
slideshow. Shift Command F.
Shift Command F. I think I'm going to let you do that. Okay, this comes up. Anyway, yeah. Until the 60s, you can see that inequality was higher in France than in the US. Okay, so it's not that the US has always been more inegalitarian. You know, in spite of the legacy of slavery, in spite of everything you can imagine, in fact, the US was a pretty egalitarian country, at least as compared to European countries, until quite recently. Okay, so this suggests that institutions matter, you know, and political choices matter. You know, it's not just it's always been like that, and there's nothing we can do about it. If we look a little bit more details. So here, this is the top 1% share. So again, you can see that the US is at the very top of the evolution. Other English-speaking countries like the UK or Canada also have an upward trend, but there is no no country where it is as big as in the US. If you take continental Europe and Japan, you have almost no trend at the end of the period, or at least it's much smaller than in the US, which is really puzzling because, again, this suggests that institutions matter and that this is not simply an economic evolution. If that was a purely, if you're looking for a purely economic explanation, you're going to have a hard time because the change in technology, the change in economic organization, information technologies, can you believe, have also occurred in Japan and in Europe and not only in the US. So, there are a lot of skill of explanation based on technology and the rise of return to skill for high skill, which just don't work because otherwise you would see at least some of the same evolution in other countries as well. Southern Europe, you don't see it. Just a couple of emerging countries. Well, you see, in Argentina, in South Africa, a rise, but you never see a country where the top 1% share is as large as in the US. The only country we could find is Colombia, where you have about 20% for the top 1%. Although, in fact, the US has overtaken Colombia during the year 2000. I mean, I'm pushing it a little bit because I think the Colombian estimates are probably an underestimate given tax evasion in these countries. On the other hand, you should also keep in mind that the US estimates are also lower bound estimates in the sense that, for instance, we didn't try to correct for all the form of tax-exempt capital incomes that exist. Okay? And these days, the ratio between the capital income you get in income tax return and the capital income as measured by national accounts is very low, in particular in the US. And if we were making a correction that will push the number quite a bit higher, it's hard to do it and to be sure. Okay, now let me come to this comparison between US and Europe. So US income inequality in 2010 is as large as UK, France at the eve of World War I, about 50% of national income going to the top 10. Now, does this imply that the structure of inequality is the same? So not necessarily, and I will make the case now, and that there are important reasons for that. That in UK and France in 1910, inequality was largely based upon inherited wealth. Now in the US, it's more based on labor income. But the first point is, as I said in the introduction, this is really a matter of degree. You have to realize that the concentration of wealth over the 20th century has been reduced much less than sometimes people tend to imagine. So let me show you the case of France and then the case of the US. Okay, so this is what happened to inequality in France over the past century. If we want to summarize very simply, so these are approximate numbers so that you can get the big picture, but they are about right. Okay? So the distribution of labor income. So there are two ways to get rich in life, either with your labor or with your inheritance. And so there are two distributions, and of course they are not perfectly correlated. Okay, so the top 10% of labor income are not exactly the top 10% of inherited wealth, otherwise it would be a bit sad. So there is some correlation, but you have some people everywhere in this two-dimensional map, if you want. Now, the distribution of inherited wealth is always more concentrated than that of labor income. Now, in France, the picture is relatively simple in the sense that there has been no major change in the distribution of labor income over the 20th century. So you have about 30% going to the top 10, 40% to the middle 40, and 30% to the bottom 50. So here I take a very simple way to describe the social structure. I take the top 10, which I can then decompose into top 1 and other 9, the middle 40 and the bottom 50. Now, this is the distribution of labor income as it has been in France over the past century. Of course, there are variations, but there is no major long-run trend. The real long-run change is in the distribution of wealth with the emergence of a wealth middle class. Okay? So you can see the key difference is that the share of wealth going to the top 10% wealth holders was almost 100% in 1910, 90%, and it has declined to about 60% right now. which, you know, this can seem like a small change because you still have a lot of wealth inequality, but, you know, this is a real major change because this means that at that time, you know, at the eve of World War I, there was basically no middle class in the sense that the middle class was just as poor as the poor. Okay? Whereas now the middle class, you know, is much richer than the poor in the sense that, you know, they are 40%, just to put numbers, you know, average wealth in France now will be about 200,000 euros per adult, 100, between 150 and 200. Now, the middle class are typically, you know, they are 40% of the population, they have 35% of wealth, so typically they have about 200,000, 150,000. So they are not very rich, but they are not completely poor. You know, typically they own their apartment or they have a mortgage that is of lower value than their apartment or house. So they are not very rich individually, but because they are very numerous, they still have, you know, a third of national wealth. And this is a huge political change, you know, in a century, because even though the people richer than them, you know, own a lot more, you know, these people, first, they don't like to be treated like poor people because they are not poor, so it's important. And you know, they have a completely different attitude in the political game, in the political landscape. And so this is a major change. The emergence of a wealth middle class is a major change that we should certainly not underestimate. On the other hand, you know, it is clear that the concentration of wealth is very large. Now, if we move to the US, here is roughly what we get, which is that the concentration of wealth has never been as large as in France or the UK, but it has declined less. Okay, so right now, you have about 70%. In fact, it's probably closer to 75. You know, it's 70% is probably a lower bound. And the big difference is that you have had a rise in the inequality of labor income. Okay, so it's quite a different history than France, in the sense that in France, or in the UK for that matter, you've had a straight reduction in the concentration of wealth, but starting from a really enormous level at the beginning of the century. By the way, you know, it's important to see that, you know, each country has its own sort of national identity about inequality. So in France in 1910, the big point was to say, you know, we are a very egalitarian country as compared to the UK. We don't need progressive taxation because since we've had the French Revolution 1 century ago, what's the point of progressive taxation? You know, that's useful for an aristocratic country, but that's of no use in an egalitarian country like France. And then in the end, there was a progressive inheritance tax that was adopted in 1902, adopted in 1901, put in place in 1902. And when the statistics came, people realized that, in fact, the concentration of wealth was as large as in the UK. In the UK, the share going to the top one was maybe 55% instead of 50%. And the reason, of course, is that, you know, the aristocratic landed elite did not matter anymore in 1910. It was more the accumulation of wealth in manufacturing or financial sectors. And from that viewpoint, being a republic rather than a monarchy doesn't seem to make a big difference. And what matters is, you know, the policies that you actually follow. Now, in the US, it has never been as extreme, but on the other hand, you know, it has not been reduced as much. And at the same time, you've had a rise in the inequality of labor income. So it's quite a different fabric of inequality, you know, in the sense that you have, you know, in a way, you can say it's more based on labor income, but you can also say that you have the worst of all worlds, which is that you have at the same time a huge inequality of wealth, although not as large as in 1910 France, UK, but still very large, and you have enormous inequality of labor income. Now, apart from that, you know, the other important difference between US and Europe, if we look at inequality from an historical perspective, is that for a given degree of wealth inequality, wealth tends to matter less in the US than in Europe, simply because the aggregate level of wealth has always been less important, at least so far, in the US and in Europe. Okay? And the reason for this can be understood by this relatively simple formula, which is called in economics the Harrod-Domar-Solow formula, which says that the ratio between wealth and income, beta, is equal to the ratio between the savings rate and the growth rate. So it's pretty simple. You know, if you save 10% per year forever and your growth rate is 3%, then in the long run you accumulate about 300%, well 333, about 3 years of income in wealth. But now if your growth rate is 1.5 instead of 3, then you accumulate 6 years of income. So it's relatively simple, but it's quite powerful because it's roughly, this is the difference, well I exaggerate a little bit, but between the US and Europe, because in the US you have a lot of population growth. Okay? So the growth per capita is typically 1.5 or a little bit more than 1.5, but in Europe you don't have any population growth. Well, you've had a little bit during the 20th century, but right now it's 0. Whereas in the US you've had 1%, 1.5% during the 20th century. Well, right now it's actually a bit less than 1%, but still it's much larger than in Europe. And this makes a big difference in terms of the quantity of wealth that you accumulate. You know, if you want, another way to put the intuition is that it's only in a stagnant country, like France in the 19th century in terms of population, that you accumulate a lot of wealth as compared to the output that is produced each year. Or to put the other extreme, a country that is very fast growing, either because of population or productivity, while wealth coming from the past is less important. You take the extreme case of a country where everybody has 10 children, so very fast population growth. Well, nobody cares about wealth coming from the past because everything is going to be divided by 10 at each generation, and you cannot rely on this. You have to save by yourself. So, the growth is a force that naturally makes wealth coming from the past less important. Okay? And that's quite a powerful difference that makes America, different from Europe. As long as America is the new world, in the sense that population keeps growing all the time. And this is also, I think, a force that makes high inequality more acceptable, in the sense that, probably today, if you take the bottom 50% in the US, you probably have between 1/3 and 1/2 of people who were not born in the US, and to them, the situation looks better than their parents or than them 30 years ago, and this makes extreme levels of inequality much easier to tolerate. On the other hand, this creates, of course, huge political division with poor white, who tend to be, to dislike, the federal government and pretty much everybody a lot, partly because of this division, and that's. But that's what's also contributing to make wealth generally less important in the US. So let me just show you some data. If you look at the ratio between the aggregate value of wealth and national income, you can see that. So what I call Europe here is actually the average of Germany, France, UK. So this is not exactly Europe, but this is a big part of Europe. And the data we have for Italy and Spain suggests we have the same evolution. So you can see that in Europe, well, you've had a huge crisis of course, during the 20th century, with the huge destruction of wealth during the wars, and even more importantly, a complete change in policy toward private wealth. Okay, so there was a time in Europe in the 50s, so the low point here is 1950, 1960, and at that time, the value of private wealth in Europe was very low as compared to national income. Not so much because of the destruction, although of course destruction in Germany and France were bigger than in the UK, but also because of policy. That is, when you have, for instance, rent freezing policies, the value of real estate is reduced. Or when you have nationalization policies, the stock market level is not very high. So there are all sorts of anti-private wealth policy, if you wish, that make this change. But of course, the world has changed a lot since the 70s, and you can see that you have a gradual return. So what's interesting is that you have a gradual return to very high level of wealth, And when you compare to the US, so here I take the average of Europe with the US, you can see that Europe seems to be returning toward higher level of aggregate wealth than the US. And the explanation for this is the formula that I just gave you, which is that, well, Americans don't save too much. When you don't save too much, you don't accumulate that much wealth. But most importantly, you have this fast growth going on, which makes wealth accumulated in the past relatively less important than in Europe. And as long as you have this force, this is this is a very important difference. Now, this difference was in fact already there. I would say, at the very beginning, because already, in 1800, the US was a country where wealth mattered less than Europe. In fact, wealth in the form of land was actually plentiful, of course, but it was so plentiful that the price was very low. So land was very abundant in volume, but in value it was less. So of course there was a different kind of private wealth that was sort of invented as a substitution, and I cannot resist showing you this, where you have UK, France, US southern states, and US north. And again, you can see the huge value of the stock of wealth in the old Europe, if you want, UK, France, in particular with land. So the value of land, agricultural land, was much less in the US, but the difference is that in southern United States, somehow, it's as if so these are the estimates of the time, but there are plenty of sources that confirm the price of slaves, the number of slaves, and somehow the private value for slave owners of slaves in the southern United States sort of compensated the lower value of land. So it's as if being an owner of land is not that useful because there is so much land around there that that doesn't make you very powerful, and you don't capture a very large share of income by being the owner of the land. So maybe you should be the owner of the workers who are working on the land, so that you sort of restore a position. Now that's in the northern United States there are very few slaves, so that's much less important. And so it will be an exaggeration to describe the US as a wealth-free civilization. I think private wealth, in particular in the most extreme form of slavery, was very important in the US. But this belongs to the past, and it's actually quite impressive to see that with such a legacy, in the end, you have less inequality, total inequality of wealth and income in the US in 1900, 1910, or even in the 1960s, that in a country like France. And I think this has to do with the forces of growth that make wealth relatively less important, and which also tend to make the distribution of wealth less concentrated. Let me conclude by asking this question, why did US top labor income rise so much? Now, one popular view among economists, or I should say among some economists, is that top US labor incomes these days are just getting their marginal product, as economists say, which is their marginal contribution to the output process, and that in Europe and also in the US in the past, the market prices for high skills were somehow distorted. I think this is a very naive view of how the top-end labor market is working. To me, there is a lot of evidence for, in favor of this other view, which is that, to a large extent, what has been going on in the US over the past 30 years has more to do with the grabbing hand than with the invisible hand of the market. And a simple theoretical model that we've put together with Emmanuel Saez and Stephanie Stancheva from MIT is that when you have imperfect competition, for instance, because you have imperfect information about the level of marginal products, which are unobservable, then of course people at the top have an obvious incentive to try to convince shareholders and subordinates that they should be increased, and there's no reason to expect competition per se to lead to convergence, because you have a constantly changing corporate structure. You're not going to operate a company without a chief financial advisor, just to guess, what was the marginal product of the chief financial advisor. You will not learn anything because the corporate landscape is changing all the time. So in fact, nobody will. So the way you do it is that, you ask a compensation committee to give you a number. They don't know how to compute a number. So they take the average of the sector. They add 20% to make everybody happy. And of course, this leads to an inflationary process that has no limit. And we have come to the conclusion with Emmanuel and with all the co-authors on which we have worked on this project, is that the right explanation for why this has increased, the top incomes have increased so much in the US, is that there's been a completely, complete change in the rule of the game, in particular regarding top tax rate, which between 1932 and 1980 were extremely large in the US, so on average 82%. Okay, so this is probably well known here, but I think it's important to keep in mind that the US and the UK used to have top tax rate above 90%, partly because, in particular in the US, there was a big reaction against extreme inequality, starting in the 1920s and even more so with Roosevelt in the 1930s. It's interesting to see that at that time, a big concern among US economists was that the US economy was becoming too inegalitarian. Irving Fisher, who was the president of the American Economic Association in 1919, delivered a speech at the AEA, American Economic Association Congress, where he said, the biggest evil for the US economy is an excessive concentration of wealth. And we are about to look like Europe in terms of concentration of wealth, and we should do something about it. And these people were pushing for extreme form of progressive taxation, with top tax rate of 70, 80%. And, this was invented in America, for good reason, which is that America did not want to look like Europe in terms of concentration of wealth. Now, 1 century later, this seemed completely bizarre that this was the way people thought about the world, because, of course, in 1910, Europe looked like old Europe, very inegalitarian, etc., a world of frontier. In 2010, the fear in America is completely different. It's not to look like Soviet Europe, which in the meantime has become a completely different world. So, every country, again, has its own history of inequality and is trying to tell a story about who we are and where we're going. I think the American history of inequality is very peculiar in some way. as a country, the US have been sort of playing yo-yo with rich over the past century. In the 70s, in the late 70s, there was a huge change in top tax rate. I think this has changed completely the name of the game in corporate America, which is that, at that time, when you want a pay increase of $1 million, everybody knows that 90% is going to go straight to the treasury. So it's hard to convince, your employees, your shareholders, and yourself that it is worth fighting for that. With a top tax rate of 30%, you kept 70% for yourself, and the name of the game has changed completely. And there are good reason to believe that this is the main factor. Now, probably in the big policy shift of the 70s, again, one objective, the official objective was to renew with some kind of, government-free 19th century capitalism. I think also part of the objective was people were getting really upset in the 70s in the US with the catch-up by Europe and Japan, and this was becoming a big concern. And in fact, I think this catch-up was to a large extent a sort of natural process, given the very low level of GDP in Europe and Japan in 1945. So there was nothing surprising that by the 70s there was a catch-up. But somehow this probably contributed, not the only explanation, but for this big change in perspective and why the US have become anti-egalitarian at that time. The problem, of course, is that US growth between 1980 and 2010 has not been better than during the previous period, 1950 to 1980. In fact, it has been worse, and it has not been better than European growth 1980 to 2010. And more generally, the extreme concentration of rewards to labor, doesn't seem to be the best way to organize the skill-based economy of the 21st century. It seems very strange that in a world where you rely so much on skills and human capital, you invent the most inegalitarian system of reward to skill in history. That seems very difficult to believe, and the gross performance suggests that this is not working so well. Okay, so let me conclude by saying that American inequality, has a distinctive character. It's not exactly like European inequality in the past. It's not like Ancien Régime. It's not like Belle Époque. It's a different world of its own. It will keep a distinctive character as long as the US remains a new world, in the sense that population growth is probably the most powerful force that make wealth coming from the past less important than in Europe. And also, if the US renews with its equal opportunity tradition institution, I think when you have, when you have tuition fees of $50,000 and when you have an average parental income of Harvard students of over $400,000 in the data we could access with Emmanuel, I think you have a problem. It's just too much. You have the country sort of being split between different group of people, and some are getting further and further away from the mass. And the US invented progressive taxation to prevent excessive concentration of wealth and economic power. And it's a bit strange that, France now is sort of following the Roosevelt tradition, well, with much less energy, because even the 75% of Hollande is much less than the 91% of Roosevelt. And in a way, this policy will be much more necessary in the US than in France, as we have seen. But of course, the reason why it's taking place in France and not in the US probably has to do with the fact that once income are very concentrated, you also have a concentration of political power and forms of capture of the political process that can make it impossible to happen. And now, if it does not happen, I think there's a serious risk that the US inequality model can become the worst of all world, in the sense that you have at the same time very large and rising concentration of wealth, very large concentration of labor income, plus what I would call extremist meritocracy, an extremist meritocratic discourse, putting a lot of pressures on the losers of the system, which is something we never had in the past, in past civilization, with that kind of degree of inequality. And that's something really new, and I think that can be quite harmful for the people who are at the bottom. Okay, so this is it.
Thank you very much, Thomas. Thank you for this wonderful speech. So I would just like to say first that I completely take your point about economies being in a range of income in which I don't have to complain too much about the changes in inequality in America, but of course we want to be in the top 1% too. So we do see an inefficiency in the distribution of income, at least some of us. So I'm not going to spend too much time asking my own question. There is just one thing I would like you to say a little bit more about, which is the changes in the distribution of income within the top 1%. For instance, you have been speaking at the end of your talk about the fact that CEOs or top executives can manipulate compensation committees in order to give them the pay they aspire to. So they are setting their own pay. But that's a fairly tiny layer of the top 1%. Or maybe I'm getting this wrong. So 1% in America is somewhere like 1.5 million households.
Right. So,
maybe you want to, yes.
Yes, it's a pretty large group, but top corporate America is also a large group, in the sense that some people made a mistake, I think, by looking only at the number of CEOs or the number of top 5 pay in large companies. In fact, in large companies, the number of people, making more than $400,000, which is the threshold to get into the top 1%, is much bigger than 5. In large companies. So you're talking about several hundred people, sometimes several thousand people by company. So in fact, when you do, there's a, so far we were not able to do the computation perfectly because in the standard tax return data, unfortunately, you don't tell your life, the story of your life in your tax return, so you just know your total income, you don't know your sector of activity. But in fact, the internal files at the IRS, at the Internal Revenue Service, can match these files with employer files so that we know the sector of activity. And some people at the IRS have done that. And in fact, 90% of the top 1% basically is made up of top corporate jobs, basically, people working in large companies. And all the artists or footballers or etc., it's a very, very, very small group. So no, I think the core of this group is really top corporate jobs, basically.
Well, one of the key things in kind of thinking about where inequality might be going is understanding the explanation why it has been growing. And you gave some explanations that are sort of related to institutional factors and kind of argued against things like globalization or technological change. But I would like to push a little bit on that. So, in particular, finance is one industry that we know is important, and we know that it's sort of not randomly distributed across countries. So it's a big component of the top income group. It's more important, in the UK, in the US, places where inequality has grown quite a bit in continental Europe. That's one question. How important do you think this is, and if that's the driver of top shares, then do you think that this is going to continue?
No, you're right to point out that finance, is an important part of the story, but still, I think we should not overemphasize just finance per se. If, again, in this paper by these IRS people who match the firm level files and the individual files, the share of finance in the top 1%, top 0.1% is about 20%, which is a lot more, twice as much as the share of finance in the US economy. Okay? So the share of finance in the US economy is about 10% of GDP in finance, which is more than in Europe. You're right. In Europe, it would be more 5-6%, and it was up to 8, 9, 10% in the US. And so when they make 20% of the top one, it's twice as much as their share in the economy. So they are indeed overrepresented. But still, you have 80% of the top 1%, which is outside of finance. So it's a matter of degree. Finance has played more than its share in the economy, but it's more big corporation, financial and non-financial corporations where these very top incomes have increased a lot.
Yes. Thank you for a good presentation and more importantly for the good work being done in France. I'm going to ask you to speak to policy recommendations. We're in the middle of a presidential election where everybody's debating about optimal taxation for the top 1%. Tax returns not being released, people are guessing. You've written about optimal tax theory for the top 1%. Would you like to talk a little bit about the kinds of remedies and policies that might address some of the growing inequality?
Well, to me, in the case of the US, the remedy is relatively simple. I think above a certain income level, you should go back to, 80% top tax rate. So I don't have a mathematical formula to tell you exactly at which income level. I will guess it's, maybe 1 million, maybe 1.5 million, I don't know. I think we should try, we should experiment and see what happens, But from all the evidence we have in the past, both in the US and in other countries, I think there will be no loss at all in productivity or growth or whatever. And this will just be the only way to put an end to this huge appropriation of national income by a small group of private individuals. And now, the other question is how, is this going to happen? When is this going to happen? How is this going to happen? And here, it's a completely different story, because you have to convince people. I have tried in France to make progress in the area of sort of political participation and political debate by creating this website where people can have a better understanding of the distribution of income and the tax system, and create. It's only a very small step in a general process. The people. You have to. Framing effects, the way you frame the debate, are really essential. And I have not done similar experience in the US, but my colleague and friend Emmanuel Saez has been doing work lately with Stephanie Stancheva, where they run experiment, with in the US, where they show people different picture about inequality, about the consequence of various tax policy, and they show how framing effects, so the way the kind of information you give to people before you ask them the same question has a tremendous impact on the answer you get to the very same question. So it's yes, political activism is is different issues than historical research on inequality, and I mean both are fascinating issues, and but I tend to focus on historical research.
Let's move to another question here in the back. Yes.
I heard that on Roosevelt time, the 90% tax was not really enforced, that it wasn't never actually enforced. Why do some people say that, and what would you answer them?
You never have a perfect tax system in the world, and very often when you have very high tax rate, pressure groups find ways to create, tax exceptions, tax loopholes, so as to not to pay the tax. And so the time of Roosevelt was no exception, and there were ways to get paid, typically through capital gains, to avoid this tax rate. But still, it was hard. It was very difficult to get your executive compensation, your wage income, without paying the tax. So in the end, it's clear that this had a tremendous impact in the sense that the income payment to CEOs above that level virtually disappeared. So during a long time period, what people were saying in economics department, and what I was taught at school, and actually what I was myself teaching to students, and I know I feel bad about that, but sometimes you just repeat stuff without thinking too much. Well, the official view was that people at that time, in the 50s or 60s, were getting paid in other ways, for instance, through perks. They would get a nice car or a fancy trip to the Caribbean. Whereas today, at least, because people can get paid in cash, they don't need to get perks, and they just get cash. But when you think about it, and when you start looking for evidence for this claim, what you find is that not only it's completely wrong, but in fact income and perks seem to be complement rather than substitute. And today, you actually get huge perks, huge plane and corporate jets and fancy offices and fancy restaurant, plus the very high cash compensation. So, and there's really no evidence at all that the perks people are getting today are less than those of the 50s, 60s. There's just zero evidence. I've never seen any evidence, and when you start looking for data in particular sector, you find exactly the opposite. Okay? So this is just one example where people just repeat stuff because they like the story without checking the facts, and I think that's bad.
Let's move to another question.
Does the inflation play a role in the inequality distribution?
Does
the inflation?
Inflation. In the short run, it can have a huge impact in the sense that there was a lot of, wealth redistribution around World War I and World War II that took place through inflation. So typically, wealthy individuals that lend some of their money to the French government or UK government or to some extent US government, there was less inflation in the US, lost a lot of their wealth because of inflation. Now, in the longer run, this cannot be a proper way to redistribute because people get accustomed to inflation, so they ask for higher interest rate to begin with, and also you can have losers from inflation who are not the people you want to lose. So, the good thing about taxation is that in principle you can rationally distribute who pays what as a function of your wealth, as a function of your income. So I believe much more in a wealth tax and explicit wealth tax or income tax than the inflation tax.
So I'm a lawyer, so I'm going to ask you on the one hand without an interest. So on the one hand, I'm surprised that you didn't bring up the point that a lot of the divergence happens not only just in 1%, but in 0.1%. So it's even more concentrated. Now, on the other hand, don't you want to say something about income mobility? First of all, in general, right? And second of all, related to what Wojciech was saying. So there seems to, in the 80s, a lot of people in the top 1 or 0.1% were in real estate. In the US, there was a huge real estate boom, and so now many more of them are in finance and corporate executives, and fewer in real estate. So that if there's concentration, but people are different and changing all the time, you would think about it differently compared to 1910 France, where there's a huge dynastic wealth, and it's same people and their children and the children of children. So that seems like something that you would want to think about.
Okay, there are two different issues. I mean, one is volatility of income during your lifetime, and one is transmission to the next generation. Now, during your lifetime, it's not clear that income has become more volatile. In fact, there's a very nice Kopchuk-Saez paper where, as far as I remember, the conclusion was that there was no increase in volatility of income in the US over the past 30 years, and they are using the Social Security record starting in the 30s, where you have the lifetime of earnings. And in fact, earnings have not become more volatile in America over time. So it's not that people make, $1 million, 100,000, 50,000, 1 million. I mean, some people do that, but on average, there is just as much mobility as there was before in the 50s and 60s. So, you have a rise in inequality, but you don't seem to have a rise in mobility. So apparently that's not true. Now, regarding the intergenerational transmission, as I said, inherited wealth is less important today in America than it was in France in 1910. That's definitely true, and I gave a number of reasons for this. But still, we should not certainly imagine that this has disappeared. Even in the Forbes ranking, you have half of the top 100 who are entirely inheritors. And I can tell you that Forbes magazine people do everything they can in order to minimize this number, because they don't like that. And also for methodological reasons, it's more difficult to get successors because they tend to have diversified portfolio, whereas when you have created your own company, it's just impossible to hide. Actually, you don't want to hide. So for good methodological reasons, this 50% number is probably less than the true fact. So, again, yes, inherited wealth plays less important a role than a century ago, but we should not be just satisfied with that, because I think the expectation, the meritocratic expectation of modern democratic societies are much higher than this, and there is a big gap between the official discourse on meritocracy and the actual facts.
Okay, let's take two last questions.
To follow up on an earlier question, in the US there's been a lot of debate on the preferential tax rate that capital gains you get. I was wondering if you could talk a bit about how important you think that is to avoid this continuing trend of wealth accumulation and growing inequality.
Right, yes, that's absolutely key. I don't have the graph here, but yes, capital gains have become within the top 1% the dominant form of income which was not the case, like in the interwar, where straight dividends were much more common. Yes, if you increase the tax rate but you don't increase it on capital gains and you leave them aside, then you're not going to go. You're not going to go very far. I realized that this graph appeared on the screen, which I had not shown, which is about the top tax rate of inheritance. This allows me to say that income tax is important, but wealth tax is also very important. And the US and the UK are also the countries which have invented steeply progressive estate taxation. But it's interesting that the only time when Germany set a top inheritance tax rate of 60% when it was occupied by the Americans. Okay? At that time, the tax rates were set by the Allied Council, and this is the reason why it was set so high. And then when the Germans took on power in 1949, they put it to 40%, which they thought was much more reasonable. And it was, it's only in the UK and US, so not only for income tax but also for wealth tax, that you had such highly progressive tax structure.
You have a question here?
Well, actually, I have a very nice question about the problem. I mean, you can see the political problem. It's obvious to, it can be obvious to us, although it's not obvious here. I mean, it doesn't really get a lot of, you don't get a lot of political capital talking to the future. But what is the economic problem of that? I mean, is the economy less efficient if it's very inequalitarian? It's like, what is the, for someone who's not an economist, it's kind of difficult to understand what is the impact of the efficiency of the economy or the growth.
I think the primary consequence is not so much about growth or efficiency, but just about welfare, which is that the welfare of the bottom 90% of the population is much less than it should be, and they don't have the lives that they should have, and they face more difficulties, just living, having the lives they want than they should, and this, to me, is the worst part. Now, in terms of growth, I think what makes the US in not such a bad situation as compared to Europe is that the US is a complex country, and there are institutions, in particular higher educational institutions, which are working relatively well as compared to Europe. You have problems of access to higher education in some top universities, which I referred to earlier, but by and large, the very dynamic higher education system that you have in the US, I think, is the key powerful force that makes the US economy and US society in relatively good shape, or at least certainly not falling behind. And if you didn't have this policy of investment in skills, which has always been very strong in the US. Already in the 19th century, there was a gap in educational investment between the US and France, typically. So that's one very important key for the future, and the issue of tuition fee and financing of higher education, I think, is going to become more and more important in the coming decades in this country.
All right, I think this is a very good way to